Part 8. Construction. What is perceived as product by others is process from the artist's perspective. Joyce Carol Oates. In this next essay, David Regal expresses a sobering realization that the impact of a strong performance is determined mostly by choosing the right trick for the right time. The Horrible Truth by David Regal. How sad, no matter how much we practice, and no matter how many new moves we learn, the effectiveness of the performance of a trick will very much be determined by A. the trick's plot, and B. when we choose to perform the trick. At the end of the day, it cannot be denied that these two things, selection and placement, can make the difference between another card trick and a happening. The rest of the horrible truth is the fact that the difficulty of a trick's execution may not necessarily play a part in its effectiveness. Certainly, sometimes we tell the truth in magic and execute the very difficult maneuver we claim we are executing. But just as certainly the opposite is true, and the very simple is very effective. In fact, it may be the most effective thing we can do at that moment. David Regal, Constant Fooling, 2001. Strengthening an effect can be reduced to this: strengthening the convictions of a spectator. If we can solidify a spectator's belief in what transpires, the effect is stronger. If she is convinced of the conditions before and after a trick, the effect is stronger. If she is convinced that you caused the effect to occur without technique, the effect is stronger. How do we go about this? I have given the largest amount of space in this collection to Darwin Ortiz's seminal essay on conviction. It is, to date, the first, last, and definitive work on the topic. Conviction by Darwin Ortiz. The expository phase. Virtually all close-up magic tricks can be divided into two parts, which I'll term the expository phase and the magical phase. Robert Houdin said that before you change an apple into an orange, you should make sure the audience knows it's an apple. Changing the apple into an orange is the magical phase. Making sure first that they know it's an apple is the expository phase. The expository phase always comes first. For example, having a card selected and returned to the deck, placing 4 coins on the table under 4 playing cards, having the 4 aces signed and buried in different parts of the deck, or dealing the aces in a T formation and dealing 3 cards on top of each one. Then comes the magical phase, making the selected card rise from the deck, making the coins travel from card to card, producing the aces from 4 different pockets, or making the aces gather together in one packet. At first glance, some tricks might seem like they don't fit this format. For example, does producing a coin at the fingertips have any expository phase? Isn't it all magic? Admittedly, this is a case where the exposition is so brief, it almost seems non-existent. Still, the production of a coin at your fingertips won't have much impact unless something has gone before to lead the audience to believe you don't have a coin in your hand. One might almost term these two phases of a trick the boring part and the interesting part. This isn't really accurate since the expository phase can and should be interesting to your audience too. Indeed, if you can't make the expository phase interesting, your magic is bound to fail, since the audience won't be paying any attention by the time the magical phase arrives. Nevertheless, It is true that the magical phase is inherently interesting, while the expository phase is not inherently interesting. This leads many magicians to treat the expository phase as a nuisance to be gotten out of the way as soon as possible. They act as if the exposition is of no importance. A typical example is the magician who says, "It doesn't matter how you control the selected card. The audience doesn't care how you control the card. They're only interested in how you reveal it." The fallacy of this attitude becomes obvious when you realize that the expository phase and the magical phase in magic are exactly analogous to the setup and the punchline in a joke. It's the punchline that gets the laugh, but it's not the punchline that's funny. It's the entire joke that's funny. To put it another way, the setup determines how funny the punchline will be. Imagine a comic who stood before an audience and only recited punchlines. Do you think he'd get lots of laughs? Do you think it doesn't matter what he says during the setup because the audience is only interested in the punchline? Not only is the setup necessary, the setup must be done just a certain way for the joke to work. Any professional comic will tell you that if a gag isn't set up properly, it will die. In the same way, the expository phase of a magic trick is not merely a necessary evil. It's a pivotal element of the effect. In fact, it's only a slight exaggeration to say that the expository phase is what determines how strongly the effect as a whole will play. Admittedly, it's important to make the expository phase as interesting as possible. We'll talk about that later in the sections on substantive meaning, situational meaning, and pacing. Right now, I want to talk about perhaps the single most important consideration in creating strong magic: making the expository phase as convincing as possible. Degrees of conviction. One of the most important factors that will determine how strongly your magic registers with an audience is the degree of conviction you achieve in their minds. The more strongly the audience believes that the coin is in your hand, the more amazed they'll be when you show that it's gone. Stated baldly this way, the point seems obvious. But I think that many magicians don't really believe there are degrees of conviction. They think that either the audience believes or they don't, and that, therefore, spending time trying to strengthen conviction is just something to do if you're working for other magicians. Degrees of conviction is one reason why magical methods are not really interchangeable, and why one version of a trick may be far more powerful than another. It's also a major reason why visual magic is so strong. A person will never be more convinced that a card is the ace of spades than when he is staring right at its face. Let's take a look at the factors that affect conviction. Emotional memory. In achieving conviction in a spectator's mind, it's important to remember that both rational and irrational elements can bear on the matter. Consider the factor I call emotional memory. Try this experiment. Perform a simple coin vanish for some lay people. Just pretend to put the coin in your hand, but don't. Patter for about 10 seconds, then open your hand to show the coin gone. On another occasion, do the same thing, only this time patter for about a minute before opening your hand to show the coin gone. If you try this test repeatedly, you will find that you'll consistently get a stronger reaction when you wait only 10 seconds before revealing the vanish. What's going on here? Presumably, you performed the move just as deceptively in each case. Yet, when you patter longer, it almost seems as if the audience has half forgotten that they saw you put the coin in your hand. In a sense, they have. Of course, in a strictly intellectual sense, they still remember they saw the coin placed in the hand. If questioned on the point, they will certainly verify that they saw you place it there. Yet, while the intellectual memory hasn't faded, The emotional conviction that came from apparently seeing the coin placed in the hand has partially faded. The more time that elapses between closing the hand around the coin and opening the hand to show the coin gone, the less strongly the audience feels in their gut that it must be there. That's one reason why Slidini's one coin routine is so strong. Each vanish of the coin follows right on the heels of the audience seeing the coin in the hand. I recall two different performances I've seen that vividly underscored this point. In one case, the magician was performing a coins through the table routine in which 4 half-dollars penetrated one at a time. He placed the 4 coins in his hand. Then, while keeping the hand in a closed fist, he asked a spectator to point out the soft spot in the table. When she did so, he rapped the spot a couple of times with his fist and questioned its softness. He asked the spectator if she wanted to change her mind. When she declined, he insisted that she change her mind. After a new spot was chosen, he asked the other spectators if they would prefer that he use a different spot on the table. When a soft spot had been selected by plebiscite, he finally brought his fist down on the table and opened it to reveal only 3 coins, while his other hand emerged from under the table with the 4th coin. This ordeal was repeated with each of the remaining half-dollars. This performer received no audience reaction to any of the penetrations. I think the reason was clear. After each interminable period of meaningless prattle about soft spots, people could hardly remember how many coins he had placed in his fist at the outset. Again, in a strictly intellectual sense, they could recall the number, but the visceral experience of seeing the coins go into the hand had faded to the point where it carried no conviction. This is also a good example of why a performer should not play up meaningless conditions. Did this magician really think people were going to walk out of the performance saying, "Not only did he make the coin go through the table, the most amazing thing is that he let me pick what spot on the table it would penetrate"? If he had asked me to point to the soft spot, I would have pointed between his ears. The second example involved a far more talented magician, but he allowed the same error to ruin a classic effect. The performer was working a trade show. The effect in question was triumph. He had a card selected and returned to the deck. He then turned half the deck face up and shuffled the 2 halves together. Then came the fatal error. He placed the deck aside and launched into an extended pitch about the product he was representing. When he finally spread out the cards to show that they were all face down except for the selected card, it had virtually no impact. He had allowed the emotional memory of seeing face-up cards and face-down cards pushed into each other to dissipate. There is no denying that pitching the product is a vital part of a trade show performer's job. However, if instead of holding the climax of the trick hostage to make his audience stay for the commercial, he had finished the effect and then done his pitch, I'm certain everyone would have stayed and listened, if only so they could see another miracle like the one they just witnessed. Remember Houdin's advice that before you change an apple into an orange, you should make sure people realize it's an apple? He might have added that you shouldn't allow too much time to elapse between the audience's last glimpse of the apple and their first glimpse of the orange. Admittedly, there are other factors besides emotional memory to consider in gauging the optimal elapsed time between showing the original state and revealing the changed state. One is the possibility of building suspense before the revelation. Another factor to consider is that of deceptiveness. Too short a time lapse might make it easy for the audience to backtrack and figure out what must have happened. If you show that a coin has vanished the instant you drop it in your hand, it won't be difficult for the spectators to figure out that you must have retained the coin in the other hand. Deteriorating Conviction. A difficult problem that arises in many effects is that, although the performer may succeed in creating a high degree of conviction at the outset, the very progress of the effect serves to undermine that conviction. Consequently, each subsequent phase of the effect becomes weaker rather than stronger. Consider the typical ace assembly. The performer apparently deals the 4 aces in a T formation. Actually, the 3 aces in the follower positions have been switched for indifferent cards. However, due to the deceptiveness of the switch, the spectator is certain that all 4 cards on the table are aces. When the first ace travels to join the leader, the spectator is amazed. When the second ace joins the leader, the spectator begins to wonder whether all the cards laid out at the beginning really were aces. By the time the last ace travels across, the spectator is certain that all the aces weren't on the table to begin with. Although he doesn't know how the switch occurred, his initial conviction as to the positions of the aces has eroded to the point where the last phase of the trick is the least powerful, rather than the most powerful, as dramatic theory demands. This is not to say that repetitive effects should be avoided. The really effective versions of these tricks, however, are those that somehow reinforce conviction as the effect progresses. The specific means that will work best depend on the specific trick. What each of these examples shows, though, is the value of maintaining a high level of conviction throughout a repetitive effect, either by means of some condition, such as laying out the aces on the table face up, or some convincer, such as flashing the face of the ambitious card as it is buried in the deck. Let's take a closer look at how conditions and convincers work. Conditions. If conviction is a key factor determining the impact of a magic effect, the most important factor determining how much conviction an effect achieves is the strictness of the conditions under which it's performed. By conditions, I mean such things as whether the deck is shuffled by a spectator, whether a selected card is signed, whether the ace is congregated while the spectator had her hand on the leader packet, whether certain key procedures are performed by the magician or by a spectator, whether the spectator is allowed to think of any card or is limited to only certain ones, whether the magic happens without the performer touching the props, or whether you do the effect with borrowed objects or your own. Many magicians will tell you that lay people can't appreciate stringent conditions, that those things matter only to other magicians. This position gains weight from the fact that many magicians who perform only for other magicians become obsessed with the conditions of an effect to the exclusion of all other factors. Furthermore, when such a magician's magician does perform for laypeople, it often becomes obvious that the conditional elements so dear to his heart don't matter at all to the audience. Does this mean that laypeople don't care about conditions? Actually, the issue of conditions is every bit as important to lay audiences as magician audiences. However, the specific conditions that impress laymen are often totally different from those that impress other magicians. Magicians' reactions to conditions are shaped by their knowledge of how such effects are actually done. Lay people's reactions to conditions are shaped by how they, sometimes naively, think such an effect might be done. Suppose you perform the card to envelope or wallet for a mixed audience of both magicians and laymen. After the sign selection has been replaced in the deck, you very fairly show your hand empty. Then reach into your jacket pocket and remove your wallet. You unzip it and take out an envelope. You show that not only is the flap of the envelope glued shut, but it is also sealed with a blob of wax. The magicians in the audience will be very impressed by the fact that you showed your hand empty before removing the wallet, since they know this isn't possible in the standard method of performing this effect. Lay people will be much less affected by this condition since, If the card was convincingly lost in the deck, it won't occur to them that it could be hidden in your hand. Furthermore, they would see no way that a palmed card could be instantly introduced into a sealed envelope. Therefore, they will believe the hand is empty even if it's not shown. By contrast, the magicians will believe the hand is not empty unless it is shown. The lay people will be very impressed, however, by the fact that the envelope is sealed with wax, since this appears to make it even more impossible to get the card into the envelope than just gluing the flap shut. Magicians will not be at all impressed by this condition, since they know that the card is not inserted into the envelope through the flap opening anyway. Thus, both the magicians and the lay people will be impressed by the conditions under which the card-to-envelope/wallet was performed, but each group will be impressed by different conditions. I'll give you another example from my own work. Whenever I perform for lay people, I always roll up my sleeves. I've found through experience that this condition makes the performance much more memorable for them. It eliminates a possible explanation, cards hidden in my sleeves, which they would otherwise suspect. Of course, this condition doesn't impress other magicians at all, since they know that the notion of magicians having cards up their sleeves is a myth. Incidentally, you shouldn't condescendingly assume that this layman fixation with sleeves is a sign of their stupidity. Let's look at it from their standpoint. An audience sees me perform Darwin's wild card, for example, in which 8 black deuces change into red nines in a totally incomprehensible manner. It's only logical for them to wonder where the nines came from and where the deuces went to. Since my hands were undeniably empty at the outset, are undeniably empty at the end, and have not approached any possible place of concealment, it's perfectly rational to suspect the one place of concealment that is always near my hands. From the standpoint of the information the lay person has to work with, suspecting the sleeves is an intelligent, indeed an unavoidable, conclusion. However, when you roll up your sleeves, you remove the last possible refuge of logic. The spectator's intellect can no longer protect his emotions from reacting with awe to what he sees. I believe anyone who performs visual card magic can increase the impact of his magic on lay people by 50% simply by rolling up his sleeves. Indeed, long experience has taught me that there are 3 explanations that are always on the tip of a lay person's tongue when he watches card magic: cards in the sleeve, marked cards, and duplicates. If you transform one card into another, they will suspect that the card was exchanged for one in your sleeve. If you identify a selected card, they will suspect that the deck is marked. If you make a card travel from one place to another, they will suspect that the card that arrived at point B is only a duplicate of the one that started at point A. Therefore, you can greatly strengthen such effects by imposing conditions that eliminate those theories. I've already recommended performing with sleeves rolled up. If you're going to identify a card selected by a spectator, it'll be more effective if you have the card selected in such a way that you never get to see its back. For example, you might have the spectator select the card while your back is turned, or have him peek at the card rather than remove it from the deck. If you're going to make a card travel to some impossible location, you must take steps to eliminate the possibility of a duplicate. Generally, the best solution is to have the card signed. Ironically, magicians seldom suspect sleeve cards, marked decks, or duplicates, which often makes it possible to fool them badly with precisely those methods that would have little chance of getting past laypeople. This raises an important point. We magicians are often spectators of magic as well as performers of magic. That's why it can be difficult for us to distinguish between those conditions that impress us when we watch a trick and those conditions that would impress lay people when we perform a trick. Recently, I read a magic book that contained a named triumph effect. This is a version of triumph in which the spectator does not pick a card, he merely names any card he wishes. The cards are then mixed face up and face down. At the end, the named card is the only face up card in the deck. This effect received particularly high praise from the publisher in the flap copy of the book. I'm sure this version of Triumph would be much stronger for magicians than the standard version. I'm also sure that it would be much weaker for lay people than the standard version. I've had enough experience performing for lay audiences to predict with some confidence what a layman's reaction to this effect would be. When you proudly displayed the climactic layout of the cards at the end of your tour de force, he'd look at you completely unimpressed and say, "Well, sure, I told you what my card was." If you watch lay people closely when you have them pick a card, you'll notice that they're almost paranoid about hiding its face from you. If you ask them to show the card to others, they will do so in a very guarded way to make sure there is no chance of your catching a peek. If anything occurs as the card is returned to the deck that makes them think you might have seen it, they will immediately yell, "You saw it! Let me pick another one." I once saw a prominent bar magician ask a spectator to name her card for the benefit of the audience at the end of the trick just before he revealed it. She refused to do it. This resulted in a battle of wills, which almost led to the performer having her ejected from his bar. I too have sometimes encountered resistance when asking a spectator to name her card at the end of the trick. If lay people are reluctant to name their selection at the end of a trick, imagine how unimpressed they would be with a trick in which they had to name their card at the very beginning. From a layperson's perspective, the whole point of pick-a-card tricks is that you don't know what card they picked. This makes perfect sense from their viewpoint. The only way a layman could ever find a card in the deck is if he knew what card he was looking for. It's natural that he would assume the same applies to you. By contrast, magicians know that most pick-a-card tricks depend on controlling the location of the card in the deck, not on knowing its identity. They would be impressed by a version of Triumph in which they could name any card in a shuffled deck, since this would preclude all the standard controls. Lay people don't know about any of these controls. For them, a version of Triumph in which their card is buried in the deck, its identity unknown to you, is much stronger than one where they have to tell you the name of the card. This effect provides a good example of how you can fool yourself into believing that lay people can't appreciate fine points and that one method is as good as another as far as lay audiences are concerned. You perform your super technical named Triumph and, to your dismay, it's greeted with yawns. Your reaction might be, "Laymen don't know what good magic is. You may as well just do the slop shuffle for them." If instead you realize that lay people's appreciation of conditions is molded by their naive notions of how they think magic must be done, you might take the following approach that I've christened Nameless Triumph. Have the deck shuffled by a spectator. Then have the spectator peek at a card. Secretly glimpse the selection and immediately hand the deck out for another shuffle. As far as your lay audience is concerned, you can't know either the identity or the location of the card in the deck. They are, of course, only half right. Now perform the named Triumph handling using your secret knowledge of the card's identity. Having the spectator shuffle immediately after your glimpse can even be tied into the theme of your presentation. When the spectator returns the deck, say, "Thank goodness you shuffled like a normal person. The last time I did this trick, the guy shuffled like this." Now you go into your face-up, face-down shuffles. This is a powerful version of Triumph that should flabbergast any audience, whether laymen or magicians. Hopefully, you're starting to realize that conditions are a matter of audience perception. Perception, in turn, is shaped by your point of view, and a lay audience's point of view is very different from that of a magician audience. This point is important enough to raise to the level of a basic principle. How impressive a condition is depends on your audience's perceptions, not on the reality of the situation. This is a powerful secret. It means that you can often make an effect stronger without making it any harder. You do this by incorporating a condition that seems important, even though it doesn't affect the working of the trick at all. Mind you, there are some conditions that impress both magicians and laymen, although many magicians won't admit it. The inability of most magicians to understand which conditions matter to lay people and which don't is a prime reason why so much of what is published in magic is irrelevant to performing in the real world. Identifying important conditions. The question then isn't whether the conditions of an effect are important to lay audiences, but rather which conditions matter to them and which don't. Here are some techniques to help you answer that question for any given effect. First, try as an exercise to pretend you don't know anything about magic. Take the effect in question and try to figure out how it might be done. Use all your native intelligence, but don't use any of your technical knowledge of magicians' methods. Once you've developed some theories, you can be reasonably sure that any conditions which seem to disprove those theories will have impact on a lay audience. As I stressed earlier, the conditions that matter to magician audiences are those that relate to the way they know how a particular effect is usually done. The conditions that matter to lay people are those that relate to the way they guess a particular effect could be done. Second, try to remember back to when you were a layman. I've found this is a particularly useful practice in gaining insights into how lay people think. After all, we all started out as laymen. When you first became interested in magic, chances are you saw many effects performed in your first few visits to the magic shop or magic club meetings. Try to remember the ones that made the greatest impression on you and, most importantly, why they affected you so strongly. The conditions that impressed you then are the ones that will impress your audiences now. Third, and most important, listen to your audiences. There are many ways in which they'll tell you what they consider important. The first is how strongly they react. If you've tried doing different versions of the same trick, and one gets a stronger reaction than others, check to see if the stronger one contains a condition particularly impressive to laymen. Audiences will also tell you what they think is important through direct comments to you or to other lay people that you may overhear during or after a performance. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a layman say in disbelief after one of my effects, and he did it with his sleeves rolled up. Another instructive time to listen to lay people is when they're describing to someone else an effect you performed, or describing to you an effect they saw another magician perform. Inevitably, they'll leave out many details. The points they choose to include in the description are the ones they consider important. If they mention a condition, it's because it's important to them. You may be surprised at how perceptive lay people can be. An old man, a complete layman, once told me of a wonderful magician he had seen in his youth. Although he couldn't remember the magician's name, from the description it was obvious he was talking about Cardini. The point that impressed him most, and which he mentioned repeatedly, was how the magician was able to perform those intricate manipulations while wearing gloves. This is a condition many magicians would think would surely be lost on lay people. The must-believe test. Finally, here is a simple technique I've found very useful in identifying important conditions. I call it the must-believe test. Simply ask yourself this question: what is the one false premise the audience must believe if they are to view the effect as a miracle? For example, in the torn and restored card, the one false premise they must believe is that the card you show restored at the end is the same one you tore up at the beginning. In Triumph, they must believe that the face-up and face-down cards are really mixed together at the end of the shuffle. In the Ambitious card, they must believe that the card that appears on top of the deck is the same one you buried in the middle. In a typical ace assembly, they must believe that the 4 aces begin in 4 different packets. As these examples show, once you ask the must-believe question, the answer in most cases is obvious. The trick is to ask the question in the first place. Once you've identified what the audience must believe, you'll know that any conditions that strengthen that belief will make the trick stronger. Conditions that relate to other issues will matter little. Occasionally, the one thing the audience must believe to view the trick as a miracle is actually a true premise. For instance, in the card to wallet, what they must believe is that the card that is found in the wallet is the same one that was lost in the deck. Of course, it really is the same card, yet you still have to introduce a condition, such as having the card signed, to achieve the necessary conviction, or the trick will fail. The fact that something is true doesn't mean the audience will assume it's true. Also, occasionally there may be 2 or, in rare cases, 3 false premises the audience must believe. In the card to envelope, they must believe that the card in the envelope is the same one that was lost in the deck, but they must also believe that the envelope is completely sealed. In any case, the basic principles of applying the must-believe test remain the same. You'll find the must-believe test is more useful in analyzing some effects than others, but in many cases it can help you distinguish between important conditions and unimportant ones. It can also help you in comparing different versions of the same effect to determine which one will play more strongly. Once you identify the one false premise the audience must believe, you'll know that whichever version is more convincing on that point will get the stronger reaction. What all the exercises I've just given will help you achieve is to see the effect from the audience's point of view. This is something you must always strive for, yet which most magicians fail to do. Al Baker has often been quoted as saying that many good tricks have been killed by improvements, yet Baker's own books are filled with his improved versions of standard effects. Clearly, he didn't believe that all efforts at improving tricks were bad. What's the key difference between those efforts at improvement that succeed and those that only succeed in killing a good trick? I believe that failing to understand what conditions in a trick matter to an audience is the source of most lethal improvements. An improvement that strengthens an important condition will always make for a stronger effect. Unfortunately, many improved versions actually eliminate important conditions in order to make the trick easier to perform. In order to make a trick more convenient to do, the magician destroys the one feature that made the effect worth doing. There are many elements of your magic that an audience may care about, but your personal convenience is not one of them. Keep that in mind as you listen to the following discussion. The no contact condition. There is one condition that relates to so many different effects, is so important in the minds of lay audiences, and is so frequently violated by magicians that I feel it deserves separate discussion. That is what I term the no contact condition. Simply stated, if an effect involves an object traveling from point A to point B, the effect will be substantially stronger if point A and point B never come in contact with each other. If the effect consists of a coin traveling from the right fist to the left fist, The impact will lessen if the two fists touch, even for only a moment. If the effect consists of a selected card traveling from the deck to your wallet, the impact will lessen if the wallet is rested on the deck when you first remove it from your pocket. Mind you, if you asked the spectator how the coin could travel from hand to hand, even if they did touch, as long as the fists remain closed, he wouldn't be able to tell you. Neither could he tell you how the card could get inside the wallet just because the wallet rested momentarily on the deck. Nevertheless, instinctively people sense that the task becomes a little easier if the 2 points touch. And of course, they're right. Because this condition registers on an instinctive level, the spectator himself may not consciously realize that the reason a trick leaves him cold is that it violates the no contact condition. This doesn't for a moment mean it isn't important. As a matter of fact, all the most important factors that determine an effect's impact on an audience function partly on an unconscious level. Despite the unconscious aspect of the no contact condition, spectators will often reveal the importance they attach to that factor in their comments. To the perceptive magician, spectators' comments often reveal more than they themselves realize. The no contact condition can also be violated by openly conveying some object from point A to point B before the invisible transfer of another object. In Alex Elmsley's Between Your Palms, the performer begins by placing aside a card sight unseen. Later, this card proves to be the same card the spectator selected from the deck and signed after the unknown card was set aside. It would be difficult to imagine a more amazing plot. Yet this trick which intrigues magicians leaves laypeople cold. The problem is not with the plot, but with the procedure, which violates the no contact condition. Before the identity of the unknown card is revealed, it is brought in contact with 2 other selected cards, cards which were removed from the deck after the signed selection was buried in the deck. There are other versions of this effect in which the set-aside card is instead sandwiched between 2 cards or 4 of a kind, but none of these address the central problem. Only Ed Brown's version achieves a degree of isolation by placing the set-aside card in one compartment of a wallet, while the other selections go into a different compartment. However, see the Dream card in Darwin Ortiz at the Card Table and the Psychotronic card in Card Shark for examples of this type of effect that do observe the no contact condition. Any survey of magical literature or any extended exposure to close-up magic will yield many more effects in which the no contact condition is violated. In certain ace assemblies, one of the follower packets must touch the leader packet. In some tricks in which the selected card is removed from the card case, the case must first touch the deck. In some cards across effects, the 2 packets must first be brought together. My convictions about the importance of the no contact condition to audiences are the result of very extensive performing experience and observation. I believe that anyone who experiments with different versions of the same effect will come to the same conclusion. Nevertheless, I realize my argument will meet strong resistance from many magicians. The problem is that when audiences think that lack of contact between point A and point B makes the trick harder to do, they're absolutely right. That's why so many versions of these effects do involve bringing points A and B together. While the inventors of these tricks presumably would argue that the no contact feature doesn't matter to audiences, they will usually try to structure the effect so that points A and B touch for the least amount of time possible. The bulk of what is published in magic books and magazines will always reflect what is easiest to invent, not what is most effective to perform. The bulk of what most magicians perform will always reflect what is easiest to do, not what has the strongest impact on an audience. For example, since most magicians are scared to death of palming a card, non-palming card-to-wallet tricks will continue to be popular, and that will usually mean bringing the wallet in contact with the deck or openly inserting extraneous cards into the wallet or your pocket prior to removing the signed selection. These versions may lack the conviction and sometimes the clarity and directness achieved by the palming approaches, but they're a heck of a lot easier to do. You'll have to decide for yourself where your priorities lie. Dramatizing conditions. I trust that by now you appreciate the vital role conditions play in maximizing audience impact. However, conditions will only affect an audience if you make sure the audience notices them and appreciates their implications. They must appreciate them not only intellectually, but also on an emotional level. The key to giving conditions emotional impact is dramatizing. The best place to see creative examples of such dramatizing is television commercials. Advertising companies first determine what feature of a product they want the audience to appreciate. Then they figure out a way to communicate that feature to an audience in a dramatic fashion. They don't just tell people about the feature, they show them in some memorable way. Practically every commercial you see illustrates this approach. If they want you to appreciate that a car provides a smooth ride, they have a diamond cutter cut an expensive diamond in the back seat of the car while driving over a bumpy road. If they want you to appreciate how securely a plastic food storage bag seals, they fill the bag with angry bees. If they want you to see how powerful a vacuum cleaner is, they show it sucking up steel nuts and bolts. You have to learn to sell the conditions of your effects the way Madison Avenue sells the features of its products, in ways that reach the viewer's gut, not just his intellect. Don't try to dramatize every condition of the effect, or you'll just dissipate the impact of this technique. The must-believe test will help you here. The conditions that relate to what the audience must believe in order for the trick to be a miracle are the ones to dramatize. Through actions. Consider the ultra-mental deck effect, where the performer shows that he predicted a freely thought-of card by previously reversing that card in the deck. The impact of this trick depends entirely on the audience being convinced that the performer couldn't possibly have foreseen the spectator's choice. Mentalist Chet Miller would dramatize this point by having a spectator randomly selected from the audience, then sending that person to a payphone with instructions to telephone any acquaintance within a 100-mile radius to ask him to name a card. How could audiences fail to appreciate the impossibility of his foreseeing this distant stranger's choice? The 100-mile limitation is a clever example of the illogical convincer concept we'll be discussing later. In presenting this same effect, Al Karan would have a spectator think of any card. He would then tell him to forget that card and think of another one. He would then tell him to forget this second card and think of yet another one. It was this third thought of card that Karan would show he had predicted. As he would point out in his patter, how could he possibly have foreseen what card a spectator would arrive at after changing his mind twice? This kind of thinking means nothing to the magician concerned only with methods, but it can make all the difference in the world to the performer who wants maximum audience impact. In some card effects, it's important that the audience appreciate the fact that the cards were shuffled by a spectator at the outset. A simple but effective way to dramatize this is to ask 3 different spectators to shuffle consecutively. Harry Houdini was a master of dramatizing conditions. In his milk can escape, the most important condition was the fact that he was underwater. He couldn't breathe until he escaped. To dramatize this, he would begin by asking how many people in the audience thought they could hold their breaths for 1 minute. After a show of hands, he would ask everyone to hold their breaths while he timed them. Spectator after spectator would eventually give up, desperately gasping for breath. Later, when Houdini was struggling to escape, a large clock would count off the seconds. With the memory of their own experience fresh in their minds, the audience's alarm would grow as the time went far past the point where they had been able to hold their breaths. No other presentational approach could ever have gotten them to feel what Houdini must be going through the way this one did. When Houdini did the escape from 75 feet of rope, he would have an assistant time how long it took the audience volunteers to tie him up. Then he would announce that he would escape from the ropes in less time than it had taken them to restrain him. If he had simply announced that he would escape in, say, 4 minutes, it would have meant little to the audience. His ploy reduced that abstract fact to terms they could understand. Through audience participation. One of the generally most versatile and effective methods of dramatizing a condition is to have the audience enforce that condition. How many times have you heard a layperson finish a glowing description of an effect he's witnessed with a comment such as, "And I shuffled the cards myself," or, "And it was Joe's deck of cards"? One of the things that makes the McDonald's Aces the most powerful of all ace assemblies is the fact that the performer never touches the leader packet until the very end. You could dramatize this condition by placing a paperweight on the leader packet at the start of the trick. The paperweight would not be removed until the end. Alternatively, you could dramatize the condition by having a spectator place her hand on the packet, warning her not to lift her hand for even an instant until you ask her to at the end of the trick. Logically, both methods are just as good at proving that you don't tamper with the packet during the trick. Yet, emotionally, having the spectator place her hand on the cards will be much more convincing. An extremely effective item I always perform when I have the opportunity to work with a borrowed deck is the blind aces effect I mentioned earlier. After the borrowed deck has been shuffled by a spectator, I take it and proceed to cut to the 4 aces. I do this while blindfolded, only I don't use a blindfold. Instead, as I'm sitting at the table, I have a female spectator stand behind me and cover my eyes with her hands. This offers an advantage in pacing since it takes far less time than most blindfolds require to put on and take off. It also eliminates the time-consuming process of having a blindfold tested by audience members before the start of the trick to prove that it's not gimmicked. The spectator's hands are above suspicion. My main reason for taking this approach, however, is that having an audience member enforce my blindness is the strongest way I can dramatize the sightless condition under which the effect is performed. If you think it makes no difference if the trick is done with a cloth blindfold or a human blindfold, you still haven't grasped the central fact that strong magic is about emotion, not logic. If you do appreciate the difference, start looking for ways to dramatize key conditions of an effect by having the audience police those conditions themselves. You'll start hearing laypeople glowingly recount your effects to others, ending with comments like, "And I never took my eyes off that box." Or, "And they never let go of his wrists." Or, "And she covered his eyes the whole time." Through images. Never underestimate the power of mere words to forcefully drive home a point. For best effect, these words should evoke concrete images in a spectator's mind. The abstract speaks to the intellect. The concrete image speaks to the emotions and instincts. That's why a charity will select an annual poster child. They know they can cite statistics about thousands of children suffering that won't move most people to action because statistics appeal only to the intellect. Yet a photograph of a single child in need will get people to donate because it's a concrete image that cuts directly to the emotions. That's what you have to achieve with your words. The technique of dramatizing through words is very similar to those used by poets. The poet employs metaphors, similes, and evocative imagery to go beyond communicating with the reader's intellect and reach his emotions. The creative showman will do the same to make the spectator appreciate the key conditions of an effect in his gut as well as in his brain. An appreciation for and use of presentational angles of this kind is one of the features that most distinguishes professional performers from amateurs. When two professional close-up workers have a session, they're more likely to trade the kind of presentational bits I've been describing than new moves or effects. In fact, I've found it a quick and reliable way of sizing up other magicians. If I describe to a magician a dramatizing ploy that I know to be strong, and his eyes light up, I know I'm talking to a performer. If, instead, he stares at me blankly, or gives me a puzzled look, as if trying to figure out just what my point is, I know I'm dealing with a hobbyist who does most of his performing for other magicians. Once you start thinking in terms of dramatizing conditions, many ideas will occur to you. Opportunities for dramatizing the conditions of an effect are limited only by your imagination. This area, as much as any, indicates why presentation offers as much room for creativity as inventing new moves or effects. Convincers. A technique at the other extreme from the dramatization of conditions, but which aids in the same ultimate goal, is the use of convincers. I first ran across the term convincers in the writings of Harry Lorraine. Many people use the word subtleties to refer to the same thing, but I prefer the term convincer because it underscores the purpose of the technique, which is to strengthen conviction. Where dramatizing is a big production, convincers are a small touch. Where dramatizing is clearly conscious and deliberate, convincers are offhanded, seemingly uncalculated. That is, in fact, their greatest strength. Darwin Ortiz, Strong Magic, 1994. Construction of magic seems quite technical when you attempt to articulate it on paper. The truth is, these constructions begin in our mind, often with a dream. Next, Tommy Wonder urges us to embrace this dreamlike visualization technique and learn to harness its power. The Mind Movie by Tommy Wonder with Stephen Minch. In the 2 volumes of my work, at various times I talk about the mind movie. This is a very important tool for me, and I consider it an essential guide to quality performance. Whenever I wish to create a new effect, it starts, of course, with an idea that occurs to me. I then begin to consider the idea, pondering it, and looking at the effect from every angle I can imagine. I try to discover as much as I possibly can about it. Even if the effect is totally original and unlike anything that has come before, there are still many details to be ferreted out. Then, eventually, slowly perhaps, yet surely, an ideal version of the effect begins to take shape in my mind. So far, I'm not in the least concerned about modus operandi. Instead, I think of the effect as if anything is possible. My imagination is without limits. I'm unfettered by such realistic thoughts as, yeah, but how can I do this? By constantly rethinking the effect, imagining myself doing it again and again, my misty idea grows into something crystal clear. After a time, I will know every movement, every word, every gesture. I will know exactly how the effect will be. To aid myself in this process of applied imagination, I will frequently run through the effect physically. Often I gather the necessary props and use them during these fantasy rehearsals. One valuable thing that comes from this practice is that I may quickly discover any awkward spots. A handling sequence may consume more time than I imagined, or I might find that some procedure must be changed due to the props. Yet, even now I don't care about methods. Anything is possible. For several years I have been the happy possessor of a video camera. I've found it a good idea to tape my fantasy rehearsals several times on video. With a tape of my dream, it is easier to envision it and to detect any rough spots. Of course, I can't really do the effect because I don't yet know how it will be accomplished. But that doesn't bother me. Suppose that during the effect something must vanish from my hand. In my fantasy practices, I just drop the prop on the floor while pantomiming its vanish, and continue as if the disappearance has happened by truly magical means. I'm still not trying to work out the secret method that will eventually accomplish the effect. That process comes much, much later. All I want now is to make my dream as concrete as possible. My thoughts must become totally clear. The clearer the desired effect is in my mind, the easier it will be to achieve later. After doing these exercises for a time, the effect becomes like a movie for me, very solid and clear in my thoughts. I know exactly what the ideal version of the effect looks like. All I need to do now is push it from the womb of my imagination into reality. However, now I know exactly, with no compromise to little things like methodological concerns, what I want to achieve. I have a beautifully defined goal. Not thinking about certain practical matters at this stage is essential. Don't consider, for instance, whether the effect is possible. That would only limit your freedom of imagination and creativity. If at this point you take into account certain practical matters linked to possible methods, you will no longer be able to strive for an ideal trick. Your mind movie would be flawed by concessions. The mind movie must grow within an unbound imagination. It is governed only by your taste, by what you like, by what you see as the most splendid goals of magic. This is the truly creative stage. I use the mind movie as a tool in almost every phase of the development of an effect. The movie tells me what direction to take. It even tells me when I'm going wrong, or if the adjustments I make are too broad. It is my measure for almost everything concerning the effect. The mind movie tells me what to strive for. I cannot stress too much the importance of such mind movies. These movies free your imagination and allow you to approach your maximum potential for beauty in your magic. A further benefit of such movies is that you are free in them to be yourself. This is essential. Your self-portrayal in your mind movies should be a faithful representation of your personality and your means of sharing your imagination with an audience. Your audiences will be able to experience your imagination and you. They will not experience a pale recreation of someone else's imagination or a hobbled version of your imagination. It will be a sincere, honest sharing of your dreams with the audience. You cannot share more. That is the ultimate. Tommy Wonder, The Books of Wonder, 1996.